The Chicago River looks harmless in the first light, and that is the first lie. It lies still under a pale Saturday sky. July 24th, 1915, holding the city's soot and heat and the faint chemical bite of oil on its surface. The excursion steamer SS Eastland sits tied to the dock near the Clark Street Bridge, black hull pressed to timber pilings that creak with each small shift. Her decks are crowded with working families from Western Electric's Hawthorne Works, their children dressed for a company picnic caps and summer dresses, lunch pails clinking, paper parcels tucked under arms. They carry the expectation of a day that costs nothing but time, the rare kind of relief a factory schedule seldom grants. The air tastes of river mud and coal smoke drifting off the waterline. Metal railings are cool where hands grip them, already slick with morning humidity. Then the ship begins to lean. At first it feels slight, almost routine. This vessel is known to list an inconvenient sway that makes shoes scrape and shoulders shift. People adjust their footing. A few laugh because disbelief arrives faster than fear, and because crowded decks teach workers to make room without complaint. But the angle deepens. Teacups slide. Loose hats roll. Bodies press into railings that suddenly feel less like safety and more like restraint. A low groan threads up through the steel, an unhappy sound, as if the ship itself is protesting what has been demanded of it. Technically, it is simple and terrifying. A heavy, top-loaded vessel loses its balance. As passengers move and the ship's weight shifts, the center of gravity drifts past the point where the hull can right itself. Water does not need to be deep to kill. A ship on its side becomes a closed room with the exits turned into walls. The Eastland rolls further, slow enough for people to understand, and too fast to stop. Railings pin torsos. Stairwells become funnels and traps. Children tumble into heaps of adults, and adults reach down into a moving crush they cannot control. Inside, the smell turns sharp hot paint. Wet rope, river rot mixed with the breath of too many bodies in too little air. The roar of panic rises, then breaks into pockets of sudden silence where steel and wood do their work. The ship turns onto its side at the dock, in water so close to shore that salvation should be simple, yet it is not. In minutes, 844 people are dead, crushed, drowned, or suffocated inside a vessel that never leaves the river. There is no storm, no collision, no warning flare, only a city watching its mourning become a mass funeral, and a workforce paying for trust with their lives. The roll looks sudden, until the long, quiet engineering failures come into view. Chicago is an industrial engine in 1915, and engines demand bodies. The city's air carries coal smoke and lake damp, and the streets move to the rhythm of whistles and shift changes. Western Electric's Hawthorne Works stands as its own world punch clock snapping, belts and gears thrumming, machine noise that never fully leaves the ear. Metal filings glitter on benches and in cuffs. Hands learn the same motions until the muscles obey without thought, and wages are measured against rent, food, and the quiet cost of being tired every day. In that world, the company picnic is not charity. It is management's pressure valve, a controlled day of recreation designed to release steam without changing the boiler. The promise is simple music, food, a boat ride, a day the children will remember, and the unspoken expectation is just as simple, a workforce that stays stable, loyal, and present on Monday. A free day can be a kindness and a calculation at the same time, and working families understand that duality, even as they take what relief they can get. Excursion steamers on the Great Lakes and river systems sell exactly that promise. Mass transport becomes leisure, packaged in schedules and tickets, and the illusion of safety. For operators, success is counted in bodies per trip. Passenger count is not a detail, it is the metric that decides profit. The SS Eastland exists inside that market logic. She is built to carry as many as possible, licensed for thousands, numbers that look like triumph on paper and become lethal when the paper becomes a deck. The shadow of Titanic hangs over everything. Public outrage hardens into law, and law turns into hardware, more lifeboats, more rafts, more required equipment. The moral impulse is real. The engineering consequences are not always understood by lawmakers, and they are not always welcomed by owners who want capacity back as soon as possible. Added weight does not simply sit. It changes how a vessel behaves. Put too much mass high on a ship, and you do not just burden it, you alter its balance, its resistance to rolling, its ability to recover when people move. This story is told in a factual, technical memorial record because the dead deserve clarity, not mythology. The Eastland is not unlucky. She is a product, built, modified, and operated under a system that rewards full decks and punishes delay, where warning signs are treated as inconveniences and safety margins are treated as negotiable. To understand the role, we have to enter the ship's math, stability, weight, and the fragile geometry that keeps a vessel upright. A ship stays upright because physics argues for it every second, and that argument can be lost without a sound. Buoyancy pushes up through the hull. Weight pulls down through everything above it. Where those forces meet, where the center of gravity sits in relation to the center of buoyancy, is the thin, invisible line between an ordinary morning and a preventable disaster. The SS Eastland is not small. She stretches roughly 265 feet, a working machine of steel and rivets, boilers and piping, deck beams and railings, built to carry machinery and passengers and profit. Down low, heat gathers around the plant, the sour metal smell of damp iron, warm paint, coal residue ground into corners. Above, the superstructure rises over the waterline like a promise of space, and passengers climb into it by the hundreds, then the thousands. Footsteps drum on deck planks. The vessel answers with a faint vibration through timber and steel, a quiet shiver that most people mistake for normal life. Stability can look fine when the vessel is empty. Then people board. Weight moves upward as families go to the upper decks for air. Weight shifts sideways as crowds favor a rail for a better view and a breeze off the river. A ship with a low margin of stability, low metacentric height, in naval terms, can feel perfectly ordinary right up until one more change turns a manageable list into an irreversible roll. The dangerous part is how calm it can appear. The Eastland is tied to the dock. The river lies flat. The gangplank stays down. The city reads "not moving" as "not in danger." And the deck reads like solid ground until it doesn't. The technical truth is simple enough for any worker who has watched a load tip on a shop floor. When a ship leans, buoyancy shifts to one side. If the riding force is strong, the hull pushes itself back upright. If that riding force is weak, the lean feeds on itself. Crowds slide, then press, then become their own shifting cargo. The ship's balance changes faster than human bodies can react. Continuous operation matters here. Excursion steamers live on schedules and volume. Delays bring complaints. Charters are threatened. Revenue bleeds minute by minute. So fixes are chosen that keep the vessel running, adjust ballast, shuffle cargo, add equipment to satisfy inspectors, because pulling a ship out of service costs money in a way death does not, at least not to the balance sheet. Paperwork says compliant. The water does not care. The Eastland becomes a machine where stability is treated as a clerical problem instead of a physical limit, and the limit waits under the deck like a trap door. The worst hazards are the ones you cannot see, because by the time you feel them, the ship is already lost. On the dock, a working hand can feel a ship lean and file it away as routine. That reflex is deadly. The timbers creak, the gangplank flexes, and the hull gives a familiar, stubborn whist that people start calling just how she sits. Listing becomes normalized an everyday symptom mistaken for personality. Because nothing is broken yet, because the schedule still holds, because the river stays calm and the boilers keep their steady vibration underfoot. But stability failures do not announce themselves with sirens. They hide inside ballast tanks, load decisions, and structural compromises that accumulate quietly over years. The SS Eastland carries a history of instability concerns, and she is modified for performance and capacity in ways that push weight higher and shrink the margin that keeps a vessel upright. Every added piece of equipment mounted above the waterline, every change made to satisfy a rule without respecting the ship's balance, turns normal into a lie that can be sold until the day it cannot. Ballast is supposed to be corrective water weight kept low in the ship to counter top heaviness. In plain terms, it is weight placed where it helps the ship stand back up. But ballast only works if it is managed correctly and if the underlying design can tolerate the operating condition to begin with. When passengers crowd one side during boarding seeking air, a view, space for children, that lateral shift can overpower ballast adjustments. The mathematics is indifferent to good intentions. Once the tipping moment exceeds the righting moment, the crew cannot muscle physics back into place. Hands can grab railings, men can shout orders, boots can brace on tilting deck planks. None of it changes where the weight is. And ordinary passengers cannot detect what matters most. They cannot see the exact distribution of bodies across decks and stairways. They cannot read the subtle timing of ballast transfer. They cannot measure the compounding effect of additional hardware carried high, or the fatigue of a vessel asked, season after season, to run heavy and keep running. They feel a lean and trust that someone, somewhere, has done the math. That trust is part of the system that makes full decks possible. Warnings die quietly. A vessel that survives a near capsize teaches management the wrong lesson, that the margin is acceptable. A ship that lists but sails becomes an argument against repair, because it keeps producing revenue, and because pulling it out of service costs money in a way human lives are not charged to the same ledger. If you've worked on docks, in plants, or around heavy machinery where "we've always done it this way" is treated as proof, what warning signs have you seen ignored? The Eastland is not a single mistake. It sits inside a broader era of repeating disasters treated as exceptions instead of evidence. American passenger disasters in the early 1900s move with a grim rhythm, and the country learns the same lesson in fragments until the lesson is useless. Overcrowding, inadequate safeguards, late fixes that satisfy a rule but not reality, investigations that stop at the nearest convenient cause, anything that keeps the deeper system intact. In 1904, the excursion steamer P.S. General Slocum burns and sinks in New York City during a church outing. Roughly 1,021 people die out of about 1,300 plus aboard. A summer day turns into a mass funeral in sight of shore, and the water carries smoke and ash and the smell of scorched wood and hot tar. The scene is not only fire, it is failure made ordinary. The lesson should be systemic. Inspections can be performative, passed with a glance and a signature. Safety gear can be rotten, missing, or unfit. Complacency can live inside institutions the same way rust lives inside metal quietly, until the load arrives. Then 1912 arrives with the Titanic, and around 1,500 people die. The public demands never again, and lifeboats become a symbol of moral seriousness, wooden proof that the industry has been shamed into care. But symbols can misfire when they are applied without engineering humility. More lifeboats mean more weight carried high on many passenger vessels. That weight does not just exist, it shifts balance, changes stability, eats at margins that are already thin. Owners and operators face a choice that is rarely spoken plainly: reduce capacity and profits, or add equipment and keep numbers high, trusting that the sea or the river will not collect its debt today. Technically, the mechanisms differ: fire, collision, stability, but the pattern underneath is the same. The industry's psychological defense is to label each disaster unique. Fire is not collision. Collision is not stability. Stability is not boiler failure. The compartments stay separate in the mind, and that separation keeps costs contained. It also keeps bodies stacking up in different columns, as if death by different mechanisms is less related, as if a burned worker and a drowned child do not share the same root cause, systems that treat safety as an expense to be optimized. For working families, these voyages are sold as relief. A church outing, a company picnic, a day that promises fresh air instead of factory dust and machine oil. They step aboard because leisure has been packaged and priced, because the ticket is within reach, because they are told it is normal to trust the vessel. They do not get to audit the inspections. They do not get to weigh the lifeboats against the hull's balance. They only get to stand on a deck and feel a faint vibration underfoot and assume someone else has done the thinking. The Eastland arrives in 1915 not as an outlier, but as the next entry in a predictable ledger. And in Chicago, the ledger is written not only on the ship, but in the neighborhoods that live beside it. They are not anonymous passengers. They are wage earners and their families, tied to an industrial city that offers pay and demands risk in return. Their names live in time cards, in rent books, in the small arithmetic of weekly wages stretched across groceries and coal. The Western Electric outing concentrates whole neighborhoods onto a single gangplank, and the concentration itself becomes a hazard mass made convenient. Community turned into cargo by the logic of modern work. Parents shepherd children upward with hands on shoulders and fingers wrapped around lunch pails, thinking about factory hours and Monday's whistle, not a ship's stability curve. The deck smells of damp wood and river oil. Summer heat rises off the black hull and the dock planks, and the air carries the faint grit of the city coal dust, metal smoke, the persistent industrial taste that settles in the throat. This is how mass casualty forms. Work structures funnel people into shared choke points, company floors, streetcars, stairwells, gangways, and once the funnel is full, there is no space to step away from what comes next. Risk is normalized through dependence. A plant paycheck means heat in winter and food on a table. A ticketed excursion feels safe because it is endorsed by the employer and surrounded by other families doing the same thing. People trust crowds. They trust routine. They trust the quiet authority of permission. If a ship is allowed to load thousands, then someone competent must have checked the math, must have tested the balance, must have refused what was unsafe. That is the bargain the system offers. Give up control, receive assurance. Workers are expected to accept it because their lives already run on decisions made above them. The riverfront is also a workplace. Dockhands move with practiced speed, boots thudding on timber, voices carrying over the low hum of the city. Clerks watch schedules. Nearby laborers pass within arm's reach of the boarding line, smelling hot metal from machinery and the wet rot of the river. The ship's slight lean reads like a nuisance, the kind of small problem that every machine has an annoyance to be tolerated so the day can move on. And because the Eastland is tied to the dock, the mind rejects catastrophe. How can a ship kill you without even leaving the city? When danger becomes background noise, it does not disappear. It waits in the routine, in the trust, in the crowded normal that feels like safety. Then the waiting ends compressed into minutes, and then into less than a second. Boarding continues because stopping would mean admitting something is wrong. The decks fill with working families and the weight climbs upward and outward as passengers spread for space and air. Shoes scuff on planks slick with morning humidity. The railings grow warm under palms. Heat rises off the black hull, mixing with the river's oil and mud smell, and the ship answers every footstep with a faint vibration, steel and timber taking the load without complaint until the load becomes a verdict. The SS Eastland begins a slow port list, noticeable now. A few people step back, uneasy, feeling their balance shift in a way their bodies recognize from factory floors and streetcar platforms. Others step forward, curious, leaning into the rail for a better view, crowding the side where the breeze feels cleaner. The gangplank is still connected. The shore is so close it feels impossible to die here, and that closeness becomes its own trap confidence, nailed down like the ship's lines. Technically, what happens next is not mysterious. A ship stays upright because it has righting ability. When it leans, buoyancy shifts and pushes it back. But that ability is finite. The ship can tolerate only so much top-heavy load and only so much sideways shift before the restoring force is spent. At a certain angle, the geometry turns against you. Beyond that threshold, the lean no longer invites recovery. It accelerates. Then the physics crosses its line. The righting ability is exhausted. The list becomes a roll. The transition is brutal. What looked like a manageable lean becomes unstoppable rotation, and the ship's movement takes on a sickening certainty. Bodies slam into railings that stop being barriers and become crushing beams. Furniture breaks loose and skitters like tools dropped on a shop floor, gaining speed on the tilt. Glass shatters. Metal complains deep. Stressed groans through rivets and frames. Steam hisses from somewhere below, and thousands of voices turn from mourning excitement to panic in a single shared breath, a roar that fills the riverfront and then fractures into pleading, shouting, choking silence where people lose air. For those inside, there is no cinematic escape route. Corridors tilt and become slopes. Doors jam in frames twisted by the roll. A stairwell becomes a vertical chute, and the body is suddenly governed by gravity at the wrong angle. People pile against each other in compressive layers. The lungs cannot survive. Some are crushed by the crowd. Some are pinned by fixtures, benches, railings, partitions, objects that were designed for comfort and order, and now behave like clamps. In the lower spaces, air becomes a scarce mechanical resource. Pockets form behind bulkheads. Breath turns hot and wet. River water forces itself through openings, black and cold, carrying the taste of oil. The ship is on its side at the dock, but the interior behaves like a sealed wreck, and the distance to safety becomes irrelevant when the exits are now walls. Outside, onlookers run toward the screens and meet a nightmare that looks like an engineering diagram made flesh. A passenger ship lying sideways in the Chicago River, its windows now below the surface, its decks now walls, its crowded interior turned into a crushing machine. The roll is the beginning, not the boundary. The destruction spreads beyond the ship's hull into the city's morning. The SS Eastland does not sink in open water. It collapses into the Chicago River at the edge of the city's own infrastructure, pilings and wharves, mooring lines pulled tight, bridge steel overhead, a shoreline crowded with people who are close enough to touch the disaster and still cannot stop it. Proximity should mean rescue. Instead, it multiplies hazards until the dock itself becomes part of the machine. Mooring ropes snap under sudden, sideways load with a sharp crack that cuts through screaming. Then the sound is swallowed by the deeper groan of a hull settling wrong. Gangways twist and buckle. The planks underfoot vibrate and jump as weight shifts in one violent movement. People trying to flee are forced into bottlenecks where the ship's new angle turns every step into a fall, where gravity takes control of bodies that are already pressed tight. The simplest movements, turning, lifting a child, reaching for a hand, become impossible when the deck becomes a wall and the wall becomes a floor. The river itself becomes a mechanism of injury. The Chicago River is industrial, heavy with silt and refuse, dark with the city's runoff and the oily sheen of working commerce. Water that should mean life becomes choking darkness inside the vessel. It forces itself through windows and seams. It rises into compartments where breath is already scarce. Those who reach openings fight for air in crowded space where arms and legs tangle and the pressure of other bodies turns panic into suffocation. The smell is mud and fuel and wet iron, and it clings to skin and clothing as the waterline climbs. Outside, rescuers can stand on the ship's exposed side. Hands in work gloves grip slick paint. Boots find purchase on metal that is suddenly horizontal. Men on the dock shout and point and run toward the sound, because labor trains people to respond to danger even when they do not own the danger. But that very access hides the worst horror. Most victims are not floating. They are inside, pinned behind steel and wood, held in place by fixtures and bulkheads that were never designed to become walls of confinement. Containment is impossible because the failure is structural, not localized. This is not a fire that can be isolated, not a puncture that can be patched. A capsized hull is an entire environment turned hostile. The ship becomes a lid over a mass of bodies, and every rescue attempt becomes a contest between time and leverage. How fast can you cut, pry, lift, and pull when the vessel itself is the obstacle, and when the river keeps pressing in? When the noise fades, the arithmetic of loss begins, and it is worse than the eye wants to accept. The final count settles at 844 dead passengers and crew, and the city speaks the number the way people speak, a factory output, as if size alone can explain it. It becomes the largest loss of life from a single shipwreck on the Great Lakes, a record carved into headlines and ledgers. But the riverfront air still tastes of oil and wet iron, and the dock still carries the dull metallic smell that follows a crowd in panic. The number conceals its cruelty. Many victims are families traveling together, entire households erased in the same morning. Reports note 22 entire families lost. Children die beside parents who cannot turn their bodies far enough to shield them. Pinned at angles the spine cannot fight. Husbands and wives are separated by a few feet of steel and water and cannot reach each other. Workers who survive the daily hazards of machinery and fatigue die on a leisure outing engineered for morale, a day sold as harmless because it is organized, scheduled, endorsed. Their lives are measured in shifts and pay envelopes and then ended in minutes by a stability failure. Nobody on the deck is equipped to see. The community impact lands immediately and keeps landing. Empty seats appear at kitchen tables before noon. Wages vanish from households that already live close to the edge of rent versus food. Funeral costs arrive like another bill, urgent and unavoidable. The city learns what industrial mass casualty looks like when it comes wearing Sunday clothes and carrying lunch pails, when it arrives without smokestacks or a factory gate to warn you. Recovery is not clean. Bodies are trapped inside compartments, pinned beneath debris, wedged in spaces that require dismantling the ship around them. The work is physical, gritty, slow prying, cutting, lifting, hands slipping on wet surfaces, the persistent suction of river water refusing to let go. The soundscape changes from roar to procedure orders, shouted, tools striking metal, then long stretches of sudden silence when a body is found. Grief becomes administrative, identification, paperwork, minds at morgues, families waiting in heat and damp, breathing the stale air of crowded rooms, listening for names, trading whispered rumors of who is still missing. The riverfront becomes a memorial site before anyone uses the word memorial, because absence is visible, and because so many people in the same neighborhoods share the same wound. The tone shifts here from reconstruction to reverence, because the story is no longer about what failed first. It is about who paid and how thoroughly. And when officials arrive to assign cause, they search for a single broken piece, because a system is harder to indict. In the aftermath, inquiry arrives with clipboards and clean cuffs, stepping into a riverfront that still smells of wet iron and river oil. The shouting is gone. What remains is the scrape of tools, the murmur of officials, the heavy quiet that follows mass death when the city tries to turn grief into paperwork. Grand juries and hearings look for a culprit that can be named, isolated and contained. The questions move through familiar categories that fit inside a courtroom. Was it overloading? Was it ballast mishandling? Was it faulty construction? Indictments are issued company officers, the captain, the engineer, because accountability is expected, at least symbolically, and because the public wants a hand to point at. The process has a rhythm, testimony, diagrams, numbers, read aloud as if precision can substitute for comprehension. But the deeper problem resists a clean narrative. Stability failure is not a single switch thrown wrong. It is a chain. Design compromises made at a drafting table, performance modifications that raise weight higher, regulatory demands that add hardware without forcing a hard reckoning on balance, inspection decisions that bless good enough because schedules demand it, profit incentives that reward full decks and punish delay. Each link looks tolerable on its own. Together they become a mechanism, and mechanisms do not sit easily in the dock of a single defendant. So the inquiry narrows, because narrowing is how systems protect themselves. Focus on the last action: who opened which valve, who allowed how many aboard, and the earlier decisions fade into background noise. The language shifts into comfort phrases that soften a preventable disaster into something manageable. Operator error, unfortunate conditions, a vessel with quirks. That framing is not neutral. It is a choice that keeps the larger machine unchallenged, and it places the weight of explanation on the people closest to the moment rather than on the structure that made the moment inevitable. Even the ship's fate speaks. The hull is raised and repurposed after salvage, a practical act that also signals a cultural truth. Industry does not pause long for mourning when assets can be recovered. Steel and rivets are cut and cleaned. The river lets go. The vessel returns to utility, eventually becoming the USS Wilmette, a training ship metal continuing to serve while the dead are left as stone markers, wage records, and family memory carried through kitchens where the missing never come home. A society that can reuse the hull must still decide what it is willing to learn. It can rebuild the same assumptions and call it progress, or it can confront the chain that made the river a grave. Because the question is not only what happened, it is why was it allowed to be possible. The Eastland disaster lives at the intersection of economics and authority, where responsibility is dispersed until it disappears. In the heat that rises off a working city, decisions are made far from the dock, quiet, administrative choices that never smell the river and never hear the roar of a crowd turning to panic. The result still reaches the waterline. For owners and operators, capacity is revenue, delay is loss. Redesign is expense. Acceptable risk becomes a line item when the people carrying the risk are wage earners and their children. After Titanic, the public demands safety and the state responds with requirements. Companies respond with compliance that preserves profits, adding equipment, negotiating inspection outcomes, pushing the operating envelope until it becomes routine to run heavy. The paperwork stays clean, the margins do not. Regulatory gaps matter because stability is not intuitive. A law can mandate lifeboats without mandating recalculation, rigorous enough to prevent a top-heavy catastrophe. Inspectors can count visible items, boats, rafts, capacity numbers, while the lethal geometry hides where the public cannot look, in the ship's center of gravity, in the riding moment that either exists or does not. You can pass an inspection and still be unstable because the inspection sees what is easy to see. The river sees what is true, and the culture of the era accepts casualties as an industrial tax. There is mourning, there are headlines, there are funerals under summer heat, and then the city returns to production. The dead are honored in words and replaced in payroll because labor is abundant and outrage is temporary. Systems learn that endurance is enough, that if they can survive the week after, they can survive the year. Workers are structurally powerless in this equation. A father boarding with his children does not have authority to demand a stability test. A machinist does not overrule a federal license posted on a gangway. A dockhand can feel a lien and still be expected to keep the line moving because stopping the machine requires permission. People obey the signals of legitimacy stamps, licenses, uniforms, schedules, until the moment legitimacy kills them. They are trained, in factories and offices alike, to trust the posted number and the official assurance more than the uneasy feeling in their feet. In your trade, what safety rule exists on paper but collapses under production pressure in the real world? If a disaster this public can be explained away, what does change even mean? The Chicago River looks calm again, and that calm is the final insult. It slides under the bridges with the same dull sheen of oil and silt, carrying the city's heat and smoke as if it can wash memory clean. At the dock, timbers creak in the morning warmth. Metal hardware sweats, then dries. The air tastes faintly of rust and river mud. And yet this is the site where, on July 24, 1915, the excursion steamer SS Eastland rolls at the dock and leaves 844 people dead, workers, wives, children killed in a place that should be safe simply because it is close to shore. After 1915, the Eastland forces an uncomfortable recognition. You can meet a safety requirement and still manufacture mass death. Rules evolve. Inspections adapt. Maritime practice learns slowly that stability is not optional. The lesson is technical and brutally simple. A ship stays upright only if its weight stays where the hull can forgive it. When weight climbs high, lifeboats, added structures, crowded upper decks, the center of gravity rises. When a crowd shifts to one side, the balance shifts with them. Past a certain point, the ship's righting force cannot answer the tipping moment. No speech, no prayer, no last-second order changes the math once it is gone. But the deeper legacy is not a statute number. It is the pattern behind the paperwork. When profit depends on full capacity, safety becomes negotiable. When compliance is measured by visible checklists, invisible physics gets ignored. When working families are treated as replaceable, the cost of stopping is weighed against bodies that do not belong to the people doing the weighing. A company picnic becomes an assembly line of joy, timed and ticketed, feeding thousands onto a gangplank because the schedule demands it. The workers trust the license. They trust the uniform. They trust that someone with authority has already done the hard thinking. Then the deck leans, the steel groans, and helplessness arrives with the sound of furniture breaking loose and a crowd turning into a single crushing mass. So the memorial must be direct. 844 people die because engineering reality is subordinated to operational convenience, and because the system rewards good enough until good enough turns a ship into a sideways coffin. We end where it begins, at the river's edge, where families step aboard expecting a holiday and meet a design that cannot forgive one more compromise. The river goes quiet, but the lesson does not.